Welcome to today's video. This will be concerning the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And we have here evidence concerning the resurrection. Because as we know, the central claim of Christianity, of the faith of Christians, is that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. And thereby he claimed victory over death and over sin for our sake and through his sacrifice. Now let's begin with the primary evidences. We have to begin with first recognizing the historical facts. And what we have to recognize is that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact a historical person. He was born in the first AD. He was known and recognized by the Jews and the Romans and other historians during that time. But the gospel witnesses, the gospel accounts, are actually counted as historical data as well. So we have to use that to find a grasp of who the person of Jesus was, historically speaking, as we would George Washington or Napoleon or any of these historical figures as well. We have to go to the sources closest to that date of their time, and we have to recognize what's true about those resources and what may not be true. But it is our claim that the resurrection of Jesus is true. And with this evidence I provide, I would like to provide evidence for it, but also receive any critique from you who may be listening, who is a skeptic, maybe critique towards some of this evidence if you have any. First and foremost, we have to affirm, historically speaking, there was a burial for Jesus. Scholars would agree, historians would agree, secular and Christian would agree that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he was buried immediately after that crucifixion. We find here that the burial was by a person named Joseph of Arimathea. We have multiple witnesses for this, 4 witnesses concerning Joseph of Arimathea, who buried Jesus in the tomb. And this location was in Jerusalem. It was public knowledge at the time of his death. The archaeology shows that crucified victims were buried. So that's another affirmation for Jesus' burial that we know. Now, concerning the burial, what we find immediately after, historically speaking, is that the tomb was in fact empty. So there was no corpse of Jesus at some point immediately after his burial, and that is a historical fact. It either went missing. Skeptics would say it was the disciples took the body and hid it somewhere. The Pharisees, the Jews of that time, actually said that they contrived a conspiracy, and they told everyone that the disciples of Jesus took his body and ran away with it. But as we continue on through the evidence, we will see that that is not very plausible of a case. But historically speaking, Jesus' corpse did go missing. This is a historical fact. The tomb is clearly empty, otherwise there would have been no continuation of the early church. The church wouldn't have preached and prospered the way that they did if the body, the corpse of Jesus, was still there. It just wouldn't happen. So the Jews couldn't produce the body, so they made false accusations, as we talked about. The Romans couldn't produce the body either. No one could produce the body of Jesus. And we find something very interesting in Matthew 28 concerning this, actually, the empty tomb. And it says this, and when they were assembled with the elders, the guards at the tomb were assembled with the elders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they took counsel, and they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, the guards at the tomb, saying, say this, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Now think about that. That's exactly what we're talking about. The evidence demanded that these people at least look into the resurrection a little bit, but they immediately went for the conspiracy. And if you read that whole chapter, the guards even said, we saw an angel, and we were shocked and we were afraid and we ran away and we couldn't do anything. And so the evidence shows that this wasn't just the disciples taking the body. This was a real reality, an event that took place in history. Jesus coming out of the tomb on the third day and showing himself, revealing himself to the disciples. But from this historical fact, we can say confidently, scholars say this, historians say this, secular and Christian say that Jesus' tomb, he was buried there, but immediately after, his tomb was empty. So we can affirm those two things immediately concerning the resurrection of Christ. And another interesting fact here we find about the empty tomb is this. There was a lack of tomb veneration concerning Jesus. Because during the first century AD and before that, in Jewish culture and Judaism, there were at least 50 tombs of prophets or saints of the Old Testament that we know that would be venerated. The Jews would go to their tombs like David, Joseph, Jonah, Hosea, all of these prophets and kings in the Old Testament. They would go to their tombs and they would venerate their tombs, bring gifts, bring icons and different things and make prayers to them, essentially. However, Jesus' tomb was not used as a place of veneration. This is just historical fact. This is historical data. His tomb was not used as a place of veneration. The only time that it was almost a place of veneration was when the women were going to bring herbs and anointment on the third day. But before they ended up doing that, they met Jesus, encountered Jesus, risen from the dead. So there was, in fact, no tomb veneration for Jesus. The logical conclusion of this being is that Jesus was not in the tomb. Just simply a simple fact. Jesus' body literally went missing, physically went missing. Otherwise, logically, he would have been venerated by some of the Jewish people. Now, this is a very interesting and a very helpful and necessary scholarly input concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Most scholars, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, N.T. Wright, would all affirm and identify this as one of the powerful main evidences concerning the historical reality of Jesus' resurrection. And it is this: the woman as the first eyewitnesses in the gospel accounts. Now, if you continue on and read this, you will see that this is a historical fact, a cultural fact that is undeniable, simply undeniable. Because no one at all in Jewish culture would have fabricated a story citing women as eyewitnesses or as witnesses at all in general. Their cultural status was very low and their credibility was not high. In fact, let us read these quotes from the Talmud, which is the Jewish literature for their religion and belief, the Talmud. And it says this: "And these are they that are ineligible as witnesses, women, slaves, and minors." So the Jews thought and saw women as ineligible witnesses. So this is a cultural fact of this day. And it continues to say, the oath of testimony applies to men and not to women. Now, obviously, there was some, misogyny I think you can take out of this, but the primary focus of this is really to observe that the gospel writers would never have used women as the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection if it were not true. It's just a historical fact. It is a logical conclusion. If they were making up or fabricating this story concerning the resurrection, they would not have made women in that story a primary witness to Jesus' bodily resurrection. From this, we can literally take away logically and reasonably that the Gospels were in fact trustworthy accounts concerning the person of Jesus of Nazareth, because they would have not included these embarrassing details. Now we see also that the immediately proclamation of the early church, and this proclamation began right after the resurrection, the day of Pentecost, which was only 10 days after the resurrection, almost 10 days after the resurrection. It contains immediately proclamation of Jesus' resurrection. Their proclamation wasn't anything other than this: Christ has been raised, and we are the witnesses. We can witness to this bodily resurrection that we have seen with our own eyes. This was their testimony. We read in the first sermon ever given of the early church, Acts 2:14-41. Peter says, Christ has been raised, and we are the witnesses. So it was very plain and very clear that the church's early proclamation centered upon the bodily, physical, literal resurrection of Jesus Christ. There was no other focus of preaching. It was Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. We look unto him and we repent and believe in him because he is the true God-man. And so Paul says as well, this is very important as well, this is why it is the center of the church's preaching. It is the central claim of Christianity. The faith that Paul declared and all of the writers of the New Testament declared would be in vain, would be useless, in other words, if Christ was not raised from the dead. And so we really have to ponder and trust the evidence, or look into the evidence and examine it concerning the resurrection. And there is good reason to believe the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And the other focus of evidence would be the literal eyewitness accounts. We find this in Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, John 20. So all of the Gospels, all the four Gospels have these eyewitness accounts in them concerning the bodily, physical resurrection of Christ. And there are a variety of New Testament sources as well outside of the four Gospels. Peter in Acts 2, in 1 Peter, his letter, and Paul in 1 Corinthians, in Romans, and Jude in Jude 1, James, the brother of Jesus, in James 1 and 2:1, and the 12 apostles altogether in Acts 2, 4, 10. And something very interesting that Paul declares in 1 Corinthians 15, which is a very strong evidence for the resurrection, is this. He says in 1 Corinthians 15:6, more than 500 brothers at one time witnessed the risen Christ. This is a powerful testimony because when he's declaring this to this church, the church would have been able to examine these claims. And they would have been able to go to these 500 different people who Paul says some were dead and some were alive. They'd be able to question them and say, did you really see the Christ? Did you really see him risen from the dead? They would be able to examine these claims Paul was giving. And there was no obstinance to that claim. And that further showcases the evidence that demands that we declare Christ is risen from the dead. The significance of this eyewitness accounts is just in general the multiple and the plethora of witnesses themselves. Because if it was just one witness, it would be easy to conclude that they were hallucinating or that they were, creating a mythical story to do themselves and attempt their own plan at getting famous or anything like that. But because it's such a broad map of witnesses, it strengthens the claim that this is a true story. It just strengthens it. Because as we will see later on, there's no probable case of it being a hallucination, because hallucinations are extremely subjective. We learn this from psychology. Hallucinations do not happen to multiple people. It happens personally to one person. Appearances of Jesus continue as we see Mary Magdalene, one of the first witnesses, a woman, again, so not very probable if this was a made-up story, but it is found in John 20, 11-18, the multiple woman at the tombstone, Matthew 18, the Emmaus disciples on the road of Emmaus, Luke 24, Simon Peter, Luke 24, disciples without Thomas in Luke 24, the disciples with Thomas in John 20, the disciples at the Sea of Galilee in John 21, the disciples at Mount of Galilee in Matthew 28, the disciples in general in Luke 24, the 500 believers in 1 Corinthians, James in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul in Acts 9. And the significance of this, the powerful testimony of this, is that there were a plethora of eyewitnesses to the risen Christ. And the only logical reasonable conclusion would be, if we're honest and intellectually minded, historians would agree, scholars would agree, that the honest, intelligible, reasonable conclusion of this evidence would be that there was, at least the disciples did see the risen Christ in some way or fashion. And so as we continue on, the fact of the matter was that this resurrection story was very quickly just common knowledge throughout Jerusalem and throughout the empire. The question wasn't how or why. Or sorry, the question was how. How did this happen? How did this resurrection happen? Or why? Why did it happen? But as we see, the earliest writings, only less than 20 years after Christ, the earliest writings declare Jesus is risen, and provides a clear tradition of resurrection. The church began with the reality of the resurrection, and they would not have continued without the reality of the resurrection. And the Jews would have absolutely produced the body if they had it in possession. The Jewish response also provides strong evidence for the case of the resurrection, because the Jewish polemic does not dispute the missing body of Jesus. They can't, because they don't have the body. But they give an alternate explanation, saying his body was stolen. This demonstrates the validity of the empty tomb, and the most plausible explanation for the empty tomb was an actual risen Jesus, due to the other evidence, not this plainly alone. But when you grab all the evidence together, it demands a strong verdict. Now we come to the martyrdom, and this is one of the strongest cases and strongest evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. You see in this picture how the apostles died. You may be shocked. I don't know if you've seen this, but look at this quote from Sean McDowell, I believe. The apostles' willingness to face persecution and martyrdom indicates more than any other conceivable course their sincere devotion and conviction that Jesus did indeed appear to them risen from the dead. This is a quote from Craig S. Keener. The disciples' testimony was not fabricated. Ancients also recognized the willingness of people to die for their convictions verified at least the sincerity of their motives, arguing against fabrication. People, of course, regularly for values that are false. They do not, however, ordinarily die voluntarily for what they believe is false. So that is the primary distinction between, a Muslim who dies for their religion, for their faith, shouting Allah Akbar, and the difference between these apostles who died because they were witnesses and they could declare if it was true or false. So the psychology of it was completely different. And here's the argument. Here's the premises. Number one, people will sometimes die for beliefs they think are true, example, Muslims, but not for something they know is a deliberate lie, like the apostles. They would have known if this was a deliberate lie. They were either witnesses of Jesus' resurrection or they were not. But if they were not literal witnesses, they would have known that and would not have been willing to die. That is the difference between other religious people who die for their faith. Number two, the apostles claimed to be eyewitnesses of the risen Christ. Number three, many of these eyewitnesses were persecuted and murdered for this claim. Number four, therefore, the apostles sincerely believed they had seen the risen Christ and were not spreading a fabricated story. And this is the most plausible, reasonable, evidence-based claim we have concerning the resurrection. So we have 5 primary truths that confirm this central claim of Christianity. Number 1 is the pre-resurrection facts. This would be Jesus' prophetic utterances concerning his death, burial, and resurrection. He says this in multiple of the Gospels. I'm coming to Jerusalem and I will be beat, mocked, and killed by the Romans and the Jews. And on the 3rd day I will rise. He literally says this before it happens. And so the crucifixion was an absolute death blow. No one survived it at all. This is never the case. So these are some pre-resurrection facts. And so number 2 is post-resurrection facts. which are the eyewitness accounts, the apostles' and disciples' martyrdom, the astronomical growth of the church and expansion of the gospel, the lack of opposition from Romans and Jews that successfully stopped Christianity. All of these combine as post-resurrection facts and evidences that we can claim Christ is risen. Number 3 is the established historical fact. Historically reliable accounts, trustworthy documents and manuscripts concerning this time. That would be the 4 Gospels and the other letters of the apostles, and Josephus' writings, Pliny the Younger's writings, other Roman historians mention the Christians who claim that Jesus was risen. They mention this, and it is an indirect historical reliable account concerning this claim. And so number 4 is an established psychological fact, which is what we just talked about with the disciples' martyrdom. No one dies for something they know to be a lie, yet claims to be true. And especially no one dies for something they know to be a lie in such a brutal and torturous way. Upside down crucifixion, boiled alive and beheaded. No one goes into that for something they know to be a lie. It's just psychologically proven. This is a fact. You can go research it yourself. So this is a strong, powerful evidence for the resurrection claim. Number 5 is the established sociological fact, and that is Christianity spread rapidly throughout many regions despite persecution, opposition, and a lack of political power. Large numbers of people from different social classes and cultures accepted the message and formed growing Christian communities. This is just sociological, studied, and fact, and it shows that Christianity is dependent. It is dependent upon the resurrection. But throughout all this evidence, we can show and properly, reasonably claim that Jesus did in fact resurrect. There are some extra biblical sources we have here from Josephus, from Tacitus, a Roman historian, from Suetonius in AD 69, from Pliny the Younger. You can take your time to read these. And in the next video, we will discuss 5 possible theories. If Jesus didn't raise from the dead, what do the skeptics say? What do the atheists say concerning the resurrection claim? And so on the next video, we will discuss that. But thus far, we can confidently assert that through the evidence, the historical data, the psychological data, the sociological data, all of these sciences and philosophical data, we can confidently claim and assert that it is probable or reasonable to conclude that the resurrection is a historical event that happened. Thank you. God bless.